On June 5, 1944, a camera captured one of World War II's most iconic images, a young paratrooper named Bob Newty, surrounded by his fellow soldiers aboard a C-47 aircraft moments before jumping into Nazi-occupied France. This is his untold story. In the fading light of June 5, 1944, a camera shutter clicked inside a C-47 Dakota at WWII Airfield, England. The young man in the center of the frame didn't know it yet, but his face, tense, burdened, resolute, would become one of the most recognizable images of World War II. His name was Bob Newty. He was 20 years old, and in less than an hour he would jump into the darkness over Nazi-occupied France carrying 250 pounds of weapons and explosives into hell. To understand Bob Newty's journey, we must first understand the elite unit he belonged to, Fox Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion, 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. The 101st Airborne was activated in August 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. These men were volunteers, every single one. To earn the right to wear the silver wings on their chest, they had to survive some of the most brutal training in the American military. Bob Newty enlisted in the United States Army on February 25, 1943. He was born April 30, 1924 in Pellston, Michigan, the son of Joseph and Anna Newty. His family had relocated to Croghan, New York when Robert was young. He attended Father Leo Memorial High School and had considered joining the priesthood, but the war changed everything. After boot camp, Newty was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, the home of airborne training. Here, young men were forged into paratroopers. They learned to pack parachutes, to jump from towers, to land without breaking their legs. They learned to kill, to survive. Most importantly, they learned to trust the man next to them with their lives. By late 1943, Newty had earned his jump wings and was assigned to Fox Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 506th was part of the 2nd Battalion, and their motto was simple, Currahee, a Cherokee word meaning stands alone. It was the name of a mountain in Georgia where they'd trained, where they'd suffered, where they'd become brothers. In 1944, the entire 101st Airborne was shipped to England to prepare for the largest amphibious invasion in human history, Operation Overlord, the liberation of Europe, D-Day. WWII Airfield, Devon, England, June 5, 1944. The air was thick with tension. For weeks, the men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions had been confined to their bases, sealed off from the outside world. They knew something big was coming. Then, on June 4th, the briefings began. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had given the order. Despite terrible weather over the English Channel, the invasion would proceed on June 6th, and the airborne divisions would go in first, hours before the seaborne forces hit the beaches. The mission was critical. The 101st Airborne Division would drop behind Utah Beach on the Cotentin Peninsula. Their objectives were clear: secure the causeway exits from Utah Beach, destroy German positions, capture key road junctions, and hold the ground until the seaborne forces could link up with them. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had multiple objectives, but they all required the same thing: land in hostile territory, in the dark, surrounded by enemy forces, and fight. Newty remembered preparing for the jump. Each paratrooper was loaded down with an almost incomprehensible amount of equipment. Standard loadout included an M1 Garand rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, a knife, a first aid kit, reserve parachute, main parachute, and personal items. But Newty carried more. Newty was a weapons specialist. He carried his M1 rifle. He carried a bazooka. He carried 3 bazooka rockets, each weighing several pounds. He carried landmines. He later recalled that he must have weighed at least 250 pounds fully loaded. Some men could barely stand under the weight. Moving was difficult. Falling could be fatal. And then, in the late afternoon light, as men boarded the C-47s that would carry them to Normandy, a photographer moved through the aircraft. His name remains unknown, but the image he captured would become immortal. There, in the center of the frame, is Bob Newty. His face is serious, almost stern. His eyes look off to the side, lost in thought. Around him, other young men sit in similar poses, each lost in their own private war before the war had even begun. The weight of their mission is written on every face. This photograph was first published on Air Force magazine in August 1944 with the simple caption, "To Normandy by Air." It captured something raw and real, the moment before the jump, the quiet terror, the grim determination. It became one of the war's most iconic images, reproduced thousands of times in newspapers, magazines, history books, and documentaries. But for Bob Nudie, sitting in that aircraft, the photograph was the furthest thing from his mind. He was focused on one thing: survival. At approximately 22:30 hours on June 5th, the C-47s of the 50th and 53rd Troop Carrier Wings began their takeoff sequence. 432 aircraft would carry the men of the 101st Airborne into battle. The flight across the English Channel would take roughly 90 minutes. Inside the aircraft, the roar of engines was deafening. Men sat knee to knee, unable to move under the weight of their gear. Some prayed, some sang, some just stared at the floor. There was no conversation. The noise made it impossible. But even without words, each man knew what the others were thinking. Would they survive the night? The plan called for precision. The Pathfinders, elite scouts equipped with radar beacons, had jumped 30 minutes earlier to mark the drop zones with lights and electronic signals. The main force would follow, dropping in designated zones marked with letters. Drop zone A, C, and D for the 101st. But as the formations approached the French coast, everything began to fall apart. Cloud cover was heavier than expected. German anti-aircraft fire, flak, lit up the sky. Tracer rounds streaked past aircraft fuselages. Some C-47s were hit. Some went down in flames. Pilots broke formation, taking evasive action, banking hard to avoid the fire. Bob Nudie's aircraft was in the second wave, assigned to drop the 506th PIR over Drop Zone C, approximately 1 mile west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. But the chaos in the sky scattered the formation. Pilots, disoriented by clouds and flak, dropped their sticks wherever they could. Some paratroopers landed miles from their intended targets. The red light came on, 6 minutes from the drop zone. Jumpmaster at the door, shouting commands that could barely be heard over the roar of engines and flak explosions. Men stood, hooked their static lines to the cable running the length of the fuselage. Each man checked the parachute of the man in front of him. Green light. Go, go, go. Bob Nudie stepped into the void, 500 feet above Nazi-occupied France. Darkness, wind, the jerk of the parachute deploying, and then silence. For a few precious seconds, there was only the wind, the sound of his own breathing, the rustle of silk above him. But that silence didn't last. Below, the ground erupted with gunfire. German soldiers, alerted by the sound of aircraft engines and the sight of parachutes silhouetted against the moon, opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked upward. Paratroopers were hit in the air, hanging helplessly in their harnesses. Bob Nudie hit the ground somewhere near Sainte-Marie-Église, a small town that had become the epicenter of the American airborne assault. He later recalled landing behind the mayor's house, off target, but alive. Sainte-Marie-Église was supposed to be an objective of the 82nd Airborne Division, specifically the 505th Paratrooper Infantry Regiment. But the scattered drops meant that paratroopers from different units, 101st, 82nd, different regiments, different companies, were mixed together across miles of Norman countryside. The first moments on the ground were chaos. Nudie cut away his parachute harness, chambered around in his M1, and tried to orient himself. The Normandy bocage, ancient hedgerows that divided the fields, made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Every shadow could be a German soldier. Every sound could be an enemy patrol. Nearby, in the town square of Sainte-Mère-Église, one of D-Day's most famous incidents was unfolding. Private John Steele of the 505th PIR had his parachute catch on the church steeple. He hung there, playing dead for 45 minutes while German and American forces fought in the streets below. But Bob Nudie didn't know about John Steele. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know where his unit was. He only knew he had to move. The paratroopers had been issued small metal cricket clickers to identify each other in the dark. 1 click, the challenge. 2 clicks, the response. Through the darkness, scattered across miles of hostile territory, American paratroopers clicked and gathered. Small groups formed. Officers, those who had survived, took command. Sergeants rallied men. The mission continued. By dawn on June 6th, despite the catastrophic drop, the paratroopers had achieved something remarkable. Small bands of Americans had seized key objectives. Bridges were held. Causeways from Utah Beach were secured. German communications were disrupted. But the cost was staggering. Hundreds of paratroopers were dead, captured, or missing. By June 10th, the immediate D-Day objectives had been achieved. The 4th Infantry Division had linked up with the airborne forces. The beachhead was secure. But a critical gap remained between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, a gap that ran through the town of Carentan. Carentan was a small city of just over 4,000 civilians, but it was the largest community in the lower Cotentin Peninsula. More importantly, it straddled the main highway from Cherbourg to Cannes and controlled the railroad from Paris. Whoever held Carentan controlled the communications and supply lines of the entire region. The Germans understood this. Defending the town were 2 battalions of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite German paratroopers commanded by Oberst Friedrich von der Heikte. These were hardened veterans, many having fought on the Eastern Front. Hitler himself had designated Carentan a stronghold, meaning it must be held at all costs. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, was given a direct order: take Carentan. The mission fell primarily to the 502nd and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments. The approach to the town required crossing several causeways, narrow raised roads through flooded marshland. These causeways were killing zones. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery had every inch pre-registered. The fighting was brutal. On June 10th and 11th, the 502nd PIR assaulted across the main causeway, National Road 13. It became known as Purple Heart Lane. German fire was so intense that the 3rd Battalion of the 502nd lost more than 2/3 of its men. At night, German Stuka dive bombers appeared overhead, dropping flares and strafing the exposed Americans on the causeway. Nearly 30 men were killed in a single pass. On June 11th, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 502nd made a desperate decision. Pinned down by German fire, unable to advance or retreat, he ordered a bayonet charge. It was an act of World War I desperation in a World War II battle, but it worked. The Germans, shocked by the American ferocity, fell back. By the evening of June 12th, the Germans had run out of ammunition. Von der Heikte ordered his men to withdraw under cover of darkness. Around midnight, as the Germans pulled out, American artillery hammered the town. At dawn on June 13th, elements of the 406th PIR and 327th Glider Infantry Regiment entered Carentan. The town was liberated. But the battle wasn't over. On June 13th, the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, delayed by Allied air attacks, finally reached the outskirts of Carentan. They launched a massive counterattack. The objective: retake the town and split the American beachheads. The 506th PIR bore the brunt of the assault. Fox Company, Bob Nudi's company, was on the left flank. They were outnumbered and outgunned. German assault guns and panzer grenadiers pushed forward through the hedgerows. By 10:30 a.m., the Americans were being pushed back towards the outskirts of Carentan. The fighting around Donville Manor and Hill 30, later known as the Battle of Bloody Gulch, was some of the most intense of the entire Normandy campaign. Hedgerow to hedgerow, yard by yard, the Germans advanced. American casualties mounted. And then, at the critical moment, American armor arrived. Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, Sherman tanks and mechanized infantry smashed into the German flank. The German attack stalled, then collapsed. By late afternoon on June 13th, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was in retreat. Carentan was secure. During the fighting at Carentan, Bob Nudi was hit. A leg wound, shrapnel, or bullet, the records don't specify. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was enough to take him out of the fight. He was evacuated to a field hospital, treated by medics who were themselves under fire. For Nudie, the Normandy campaign was over. His war in France, which had begun in the darkness over Sainte-Mère-Église just 7 days earlier, ended in a field hospital near Carentan. He was sent back to England to recover. The wound healed, but the 101st Airborne wasn't done fighting. While Nudie recovered, his unit remained in Normandy until the end of June, holding the line, fighting German counterattacks, suffering under artillery bombardment. When they finally returned to England in early July 1944, they had lost thousands of men, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. But the Screaming Eagles would jump again. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the airborne assault on the Netherlands, and then in December 1944, they would be sent to a place that would become legendary, Bastogne, Belgium, during the Battle of the Bulge. Bob Nudie returned to duty. His service record shows he participated in the Market Garden campaign and was present during the siege of Bastogne, where the 101st, surrounded and outnumbered, refused to surrender. He was promoted to sergeant. He received multiple service medals. On November 29, 1945, he was honorably discharged from active duty at Fort Dix, New Jersey. But the photograph taken on the evening of June 5, 1944, lived on. That image of Bob Nudie and his fellow paratroopers, faces tense and resolute, became something more than just a wartime snapshot. It became a symbol, a representation of every young man who climbed into a C-47 that night, every soldier who jumped into the darkness, every paratrooper who fought and bled and died in Normandy. For decades, the photograph appeared in history books, documentaries, museums, but for many years, the identities of the men in the image were unknown. They were just faces, anonymous soldiers. It wasn't until later that historians and veterans began to identify them. In May 2012, Bob Nudie visited the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. He was there to see his own photograph in the D-Day exhibit. By then, he was 88 years old. A lifetime had passed since that June evening in England. He stood before the image of his younger self, surrounded by visitors who had no idea who he was. In June 2016, Nudie returned to France for the 72nd anniversary of D-Day. He attended a joint French-American ceremony at the USAAF monument in Picoville, France. By then, he was 92 years old. The French treated him like royalty. Children asked for autographs. Locals shook his hand, thanked him in broken English. For them, he wasn't just a veteran, he was a liberator. He sat in the front row during the ceremony, wearing his Screaming Eagles cap, medals on his chest. Cameras flashed, people took photos, and once again, Bob Nudie's face was captured for posterity, not as a frightened young paratrooper about to jump into hell, but as an old man who had survived it all. After the war, Bob Nudie returned to Croghan, New York. He tried to return to normal life, but like many combat veterans, he found that impossible. The war changed him. It changed everyone who served. He tended bar at the Miller House. He worked for a short time at the Beaverite plant in Beaver Falls, New York. He married Elizabeth, raised 3 daughters, Lynn, Paula, and Mary Jeanette. He had 9 grandchildren and 16 great-grandchildren. On the surface, it was an ordinary American life, but beneath that surface were memories that never faded. Nudie stayed in touch with his fellow paratroopers. The men of Fox Company, the survivors of the 506th PIR, held reunions. They told stories. They remembered the ones who didn't come home. They drank to the ghosts of young men frozen forever at age 20, 21, 19. Boys who never got the chance to grow old. The legacy of D-Day is written on the landscape of Normandy. The American cemetery at Colleyville-sur-Mer holds the graves of 9,388 American servicemen. Thousands more are buried elsewhere or were never found. Their sacrifice opened the door to Europe's liberation. It turned the tide of the war. And men like Bob Nudie, ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things, made it possible. Corporal Robert John Bob Nudie, Fox Company, 506th Paratrooper Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion, 101st Airborne Division, 1924 to 2020. Currahee.